Okay, here we are, Character Moments Lesson 7. Welcome back. We'll be talking about energy and pacing. So, like I had mentioned before, the lectures that I will be doing from here on out are going to be pretty condensed. I'd like to keep them pretty contained. That way, we can focus more on the demo work and animating and checking our work back in game. So, this is going to be somewhat of a high level, kind of macro view kind of a lecture, of a lecture about energy and pacing. Okay, so energy and pacing. So, at an overview, right, the energy in your shot can be thought of as the number of phrases or beats that happen in your shot, and the pacing can be thought of as the rate at which those phrases or beats happen. So, I know those terms, phrases, or beats can be thrown around quite a bit. They typically mean the same thing, phrases and beats. And when they speak about phrasing, this is exactly what they're talking about. Basically, they're talking about beats, and I have a diagram of a representation of beats and phrases in your animation that we can look at later that might clarify things a little bit. So, talking about energy in particular, first, the energy in a shot or any animation that you're working on can be somewhat of a very vague concept. It's somewhat tangible in the sense that the energy in your animation is something that's felt, right? And it can be seen from what's happening. So, um, the ambiguity is something that it has in common with a lot of the other topics that we've covered so far. Um, but like with all of the other topics, it can essentially be boiled down into a few things, right? So those three things being motivation and intent, drive and force, and different kinds of energies. And we'll look into each of those one by one, starting with motivation and intent. So I have a little bit of a diagram here, and we can see the different changes in what the character is doing based off of motivation and intent, right? So motivation and intent will dictate the level of energy that the character is expelling, the sense of urgency, and the intensity with which the character is performing their actions, right? So the synergy that these factors create will kind of establish a level of energy already in your animation. But something also to be considered is like the motivation and intention behind the animation itself, right? So let's break it down a little bit further, and then let's see the effects of each of these. Um, if the effects of the motivation intent on each of these kind of poses. So if we're looking at the running pose here, right, they're somewhat upright, and we can't really tell much about why they're running, right? Whereas if we begin to look at this one on the top right, there's a little bit more lean to it. You can tell that there's a little bit more intention behind it. And if we give ourselves the prompt of like running to save someone from danger versus just running, you can see the differences between the two poses and between the two characters, right? Like the level of energy the character is expelling, the sense of urgency that you can begin to feel. And if we look at the one on the bottom left, like running from, let's say, for example, a dog that's chasing them. So you can kind of see the differences in which the intent has on the pose, specifically like the line of action, right? It's very clear. And like the bottom right one, running from someone shooting at them, right? And so it's very important to keep in mind the motivation and the intent behind the character. It will affect your poses in a multitude of ways, even if they're performing the same action, right? This kind of gets into getting into the character and embodying the character a little bit and making sure that you're representing their motivation and intent, and then they're not just doing a generic action like running. Okay. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is drive and force, right? Being the second ingredient of energy. So drive and force are generally factors that are dictated by the motivation and the intent of the character, like we were just talking about. But I'm in this instance, I'm talking more about the driving forces in the animation, not just the energy that's being created by your character. So, what forces are there in your animation? What forces are acting upon your character, and what forces is your character acting upon or reacting to? And we talked about this a little bit, right? And some energy is even generated by the character. So we can see in this example, right, on the left, we have external force. The external force being in blue, right, that energy blast hitting the ground. And that's a force that's acting upon your character. And it's energy that your character is reacting to. And again, the line of action is the biggest indicator of this. So we can see the effect that this has, right? The effect that the external force has on our character versus the opposite, where if we're talking about from the perspective of the cat that's doing the punching, we're talking about internal force, right? So force that's being generated by your character and energy that's driving your character, right? And we can kind of see the effects of that through the line of action. But if we were talking about it from the perspective of the cat that's being punched, right, that would be considered external force. So it's important to keep in mind which character you're trying to embody at the time you're trying to craft your pose and you're trying to define all these things. Because depending on the perspective, right, it could mean two different things. Okay, so the last one being identifying the types of energy. So there are different types of energy that may already your animation may already contain, right? Just due to what's happening in it. So just be aware of whether your animation is or where places in your animation are generating energy, or they're carrying energy through, or they're resolving energy that's kind of been expelled, right? And so I've got a couple examples of athletes. So the skateboarder here is doing heel flip, looks like, or some kind of a flip trick off of like a stairs. Okay. And if we're looking at the red, right? So these boxes I've kind of indicated where each of these or what each of the set of these poses are doing as far as energy goes. So these first few poses, right, the character is generating energy by doing his anticipation. He pops up. And then in the second red box, we can see that these three poses are carrying the energy through. And then towards the end, we are resolving the energy, right? And if we're talking about drive and force, we can see how he's driving down into the board and driving up in order to get that pop and kind of that air time. But also he's kind of carrying the momentum that he is moving forward, right? He's approaching these stairs like at speed. And so he's like skating towards them. So you can see the green line that I've drawn here to represent that, right? He's carrying that energy and he's driving that energy forward. And you can see the force upon which the drive is acting upon the board, right? So the effect that the drive has on the board in the blue. So you can see there's a little bit of a bend here. It pops here, an opposite, and it flips a little bit. Okay. So in these other examples, right, you can see this basketball player going for a dunk. You can see that he's driving forward, obviously, right? He's running forward in order to keep a forward momentum or to drive a forward momentum. But then also in the result of his poses and some line of actions, you can kind of see how he's driving into the ground and then driving upward. And then there's this drive of like the, not necessarily a windmill, but like the pullback and like the dunking of the actual ball with the arm, right? And you can kind of deduce the same from these two here, right? The skateboarder doing a flip off of this ramp and this runner going off of a hurdle, or sorry, clearing a hurdle. That was energy. Let's talk a little bit about pacing, right? So again, boiling down pacing into three ingredients, right? So very simply put, sequence is energy and pacing being built up across time, right? So specifically, if you're talking about maybe shot work or linear work, right? Or linear media work, excuse me. Energy and pacing can be built up throughout a sequence of shots, okay? And depending on how few shots or how many shots, that will kind of determine the pacing of it, right? The general pacing of it. And so second being rhythm. The rhythm is the way in which the energy and pacing ebbs and flows or progresses over time. So let's say we're talking about a set amount of time for an animation, whether it's a character intro, whether it's a shot, or something similar, right? If the energy and the pacing is being built up in a linear fashion where it's just increasing, increasing, and increasing and increasing, that technically would be the rhythm or the lack thereof, right? Because it's just continually climbing. Whereas if it goes up and then down a little bit, then up even further and then down a lot, then up a little bit, then down a little bit, then up a lot, that would technically be the rhythm at which the energy and pacing is building up. Okay. And then the tempo is how quickly or how slowly the energy is being built up. So whether that's over a long period of time, whether that's over a short period of time, and it can be even within the context of like an entire animation. Let's say the tempo of it is very quick, right? You can almost think of it like a time signature in music, and maybe even the beats per minute when we're talking about rhythm, a rhythm and tempo, excuse me. This is the graph or the visual aid that I was talking about that kind of describes beats or phrasing in an animation. So let's say, for example, we have this bar down here that represents the entire duration or the runtime of our animation, right? And in our animation, we have a couple of beats or phrases, okay? And then you can always think of this as just like a timeline, right? So my character is running, they're jumping, they're shooting, and they're landing, okay? So a common note you may hear is, maybe you don't have enough time, or maybe it looks like a little bit segmented. So a note you might receive is overlap the phrases a little bit, right? So that just basically means like while your character is running, instead of running and then jumping, right, let there be some overlap between the two phrases. That way they kind of flow into one another. So at the very end of the run, the character is running and then jumping, but then midway through the jump, the character is jumping and then shooting. And then towards the tail end of that, the jumping and the shooting kind of transitions to landing. Okay. And this is a really great way of trying to find out also if you're doing too much in your animation. That's a very natural occurrence with animators. And when they're given something to animate, they almost sometimes want to do too much. And so objectively looking at your phrases over the amount of time that you're given, if you find that it's even difficult to just write it down and fit it in the amount of time that you have, chances are that's a pretty good indication of you needing to kind of maybe rethink your phrases or possibly overlapping some. That way it'll fit comfortably within the time that you have. Okay, so that wraps up our lecture on energy and pacing. Now let's look at the results of our first pass that we did in the last lesson in game, and then we can continue in Maya and continue on in our character intro and moving into second pass.